Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to this fifth webinar in a series that has been uh, graciously sponsored by the Berkley Center at Georgetown University in the United States and by the G20 Interfaith Forum Association, of which I'm the president. My name is Cole Durham, and I'm happy to uh, moderate this particular webinar. We miss having Catherine Marshall, our Vice President of the G20 Interfaith Forum and also uh, Senior Fellow at the Berkley Center at Georgetown and head of the World Faith Development Dialogue. Catherine unfortunately ended up having to be on a plane today coming from Nairobi, and the timing was such that she couldn't conduct this final webinar. But we're thankful to her and the associates at Georgetown for the extraordinary work they've done on this webinar series. We have had a series, and these are now available on the website, I believe, at Georgetown, and I know they're available on the website of the G20 Interfaith Forum. This has been an effort to highlight the 5 priority issues that we identified in response to a request from the Brazilian government and to shape our work with the G20 Interfaith Forum in Brazil. We are in the process of looking forward to participating in the G20 Social Summit that will happen just before the G20 Leaders Summit in Brazil in mid-November. But today we're particularly happy to highlight the work that's been going on education through our initiative at the G20, but obviously more generally, we are deeply convinced that education is one of the real keys to sustainable development. And we're thankful for the pioneering work that has been done by various people on our panel this morning. The information is about our panelists is available on the invitation, so I won't go into extended invitations, but we'll hear first this morning from Tom Banshoff, who is the Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University and also the Director of the Berkley Center there. We will then hear from Matthias Ho, who is the Executive Director of the Lemena Institute in Indonesia and has been a pioneer on cross-cultural religious literacy. Following him, we will hear from Maria Lucia uh, uh, Uribe from Colombia, but she is based in Switzerland and is the executive director of the Arigato Foundation and the great work they are doing on education and children. And then finally, we'll hear from Rodrigo Vitorino Souza Alves, who is just recovering, I must say, from as being the local organizing chairman for the G20 Interfaith Forum in Brazil, where he's done a really remarkable and fantastic job. He's a professor at the Federal University of Uberlândia in Brazil and leads a center there. So we're very honored to have this group with us. I won't take more time now, but let me just turn things over to Tom Banshoff.
Well, thank you, Cole, for the great introduction and for your tremendous work really leading the G20 Interfaith Forum together with Catherine and so many colleagues around the world. It's very encouraging to see the response of the Brazilian government, the Brazilian presidency of the G20, and taking up the impulses from faith communities, from the interfaith community. Some of us, I wasn't able to attend, but many of us here as part of this community were in Brasilia back in August. 400 participants in a forum from some 60 countries to really elevate the voices of faith and interfaith communities around the developing G20 agenda under the Brazilian presidency. And I think we can all agree that around topics such as ending hunger and fighting poverty, combating climate change, there's a lot that religious communities can offer. Um, Let me begin by evoking, I don't think I have to, we're 1 week away from a very contentious election here in the United States, by evoking the deep divisions in our world, the polarizations we face across political, ideological, religious, cultural, and other lines. All this against the backdrop of war and the climate change crisis. And religious communities, which represent uh, at least 80% of the world's population, really have an important role to play in addressing these divides. Communities which have traditionally, as we know, been divided internally and amongst themselves, but share a core set of values so vital in today's world: equality, solidarity, freedom, climate justice, and the like. So we're called to do our best to step up our work as interfaith communities around this evolving global agenda. And that's certainly true around the topic of education, which is our focus today. And in a moment, as you mentioned, we'll be hearing from colleagues Matias, Rodrigo, Maria Lucia, who have their own specific projects, their own expertise to share. I'm going to focus on universities being here at Georgetown, focus on the higher education sector and what we can contribute at the intersection of interfaith dialogue and higher education. Um, Universities are most often seen by students, by their families, as basically vehicles for personal advancement. And they are that, and we shouldn't forget that. But they're also vital institutions within civil society, places for open dialogue and debate, for research and teaching, for building and sharing knowledge that can advance solutions to the challenges that I mentioned, the global challenges we face. Um, but for universities to carry out that important social function, to advance social progress, they themselves need to be cohesive communities. There has to be a respectful readiness to engage in difference across all the divides that I mentioned, divides that are reflected within our communities. And what we've seen over the past couple of years in particular is, I wouldn't say the infection, rather the reflection within our communities of those deeper divisions in wider society in ways that have undercut the social mission of the university as a place for dialogue, debate, and progress around the global challenges we face. Fortunately, there are quite a few students, faculty, and administrators working against this trend and trying to bring together those difficult dialogues, trying to maintain the university as a progressive and safe space for open conversation and respectful manner, what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, and for progress in collaboration with governments, the rest of civil society, the business sector, around the common challenges we face. In the spirit of this gathering, I thought I would share one specific program that seeks to advance these goals. A program rooted in Georgetown's character as a religious institution. We are a Catholic and Jesuit university, the first Catholic university in the United States, founded back in 1789, and part of a global network of Jesuit universities, almost 200 universities and colleges that go back almost 500 years as part of this global Jesuit educational network, a network which, since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, has been committed to interfaith dialogue as part of its core mission, interfaith and intercultural dialogue. And those of you who know Jesuit institutions know that most of the students that we serve around the world are not from Catholic backgrounds. So these institutions are, by their very nature, intercultural and interreligious spaces. And what we've been doing the last several years, just one project among many, working with the International Association of Jesuit Universities, is creating something called the Global Citizenship Curriculum Project. Essentially, it's a 2 week module of lectures and readings managed through the Berkley Center at Georgetown in collaboration with Jesuit institutions around the world. The 2 week module about what global citizenship is, what it means to be a global citizen in practice, is inserted in a given semester across many courses at many institutions. So students around the world are sharing the same 2 weeks of content. But of course, adapting that to their local institutions. We've had, over the past 3 semesters, more than 2,000 students, 150 professors across institutions in 23 countries participate in the project. One of the most innovative aspects, I think, of our work, and it's still developing and growing, is on the one hand, issues of global citizenship have to be addressed in that local context. They're being addressed in different courses and different classes in universities around the world. At the same time, we are global as well as local and national citizens. And what we're doing is using the newest technology, Zoom technology, the technology we're using today, to connect these students during the semester across these institutions. And all of the students participate in Zoom dialogues where they're brought together with small groups of students from other universities and colleges around the world for intensive conversations about global citizenship as it relates to their local contexts, as it relates to their shared concerns as global citizens. As you can imagine, young people particularly concerned about climate change, but also issues of inequality, refugees and migration, not to mention war and peace, are very salient. We are managing also to bring together a subset of these hundreds, thousands of students in person, because I think we all agree Zoom is great, but it's not enough. So we have a Global Citizenship Fellows program, which allows students, about 15 each year, to come together for a week of further dialogue in person and study tours. So I just mentioned this as one way in which we're trying at Georgetown and across the Jesuit network to engage young people, to lift up the voices of young people, to counteract the trends I suggested that we all see of polarization, the crippling of dialogue across cultural and religious divides in the higher education sector. So that's a little bit from where I am here in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown, and I look forward to hearing the observations and experiences of all of you on this call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you both personally for your contribution here, but also for your great support for the G20 Interfaith Forum initiatives. And I can speak from personal experience how we've benefited around the world from the engagement with the Jesuit network, with Georgetown being a key spiritual and intellectual force for that, and how thankful we are for the opportunities to find credible academic ways of contributing to these dialogues so that they are at the high level we hope to see. Let me turn now to Matthias Ho, who I've known for many years and who works as the executive director of the Lemina Institute in Indonesia. He has pioneered a program which I'm sure he'll describe on cross-cultural religious literacy. So, Matthias, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Cole. Well, first of all, I want to thank Berkley Center at Georgetown University and G20 Interfaith Forum for having me here. Good evening, everyone from Jakarta, Indonesia. So let me use my slides here. So I've been asked to talk about the program that we do in Indonesia. It's called Cross-Cultural Religious Literacy. We began this program about 3 years ago in 2021, but it was interesting that earlier this year in March with G20 Interfaith Forum, with Cole Durham and other friends here in this webinar, when we were in Geneva, I heard the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights actually emphasize the importance of inclusive faith literacy in talking about addressing hatred in the society and for the social cohesion. And that's basically what we've been working on for the last 3 years, and also how the inclusive faith literacy that we are doing can also help foster cooperation and solidarity as the UNESCO is talking about for the future of education. So what is cross-cultural religious literacy? So it's basically a framework based on the 3 competencies on personal, collaborative, comparative competency, with the aim of promoting multi-faith collaboration because we believe by doing promoting multi-faith collaboration, we will also promote trust building. We've been looking at ways on how we can move beyond the interfaith dialogue. Interfaith dialogue is very important, but then we need to move further, because sometimes we haven't really reached to the trust building only by doing the dialogue. So this is what we try to do through the cross-cultural religious literacy. And the 3 competency is basically the personal competency, meaning that if I'm a Christian, for example, or if I have a certain religion, then I need to understand my own religion well, and then what it teaches me about treating people who are different from me. The comparative competency is how I also need to understand the religion of other people, but from the perspective of that followers. For example, if I'm a Christian and I want to understand Islam, then I should actually talk to the Muslim and then listen from them to explain about their faith, Islam. But those 2 even is not enough, because then we also need a competency where we can collaborate, meaning that even though we are different and we will remain different, but we need to be able to find ways that we can collaborate. And then through that collaboration, actually we grow our respect for one another and still maintain our distinctiveness and differences, and how to respect that differences. So this program we developed into a training program for primary and secondary schools and madrasa teachers in Indonesia. So we launched this in 2021. So basically there's an introductory course, which is a basic course, and then there's a more advanced course, which is the upgrading courses. The aim is that how we can help the teachers to understand about this concept, and then help them to apply the principles in their teachings. So for the last 3 years, our partnership has grown in Indonesia. We've been working so far with more than 30 education religious institutions. In terms of with the Indonesian government, we've been working with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights and also Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the basic course is actually a 1-week online course where we bring the teachers from madrasa and schools to join a 1-week program where there is a self-study using learning management system, but also there's a Zoom for live interaction with speakers from Indonesia and from other countries. So there we talk about the concept of the CCRL, but then also, for example, the Muslim teachers, and they will learn not only about Islam, but they will also learn about Christianity, about Judaism, and the same thing with Christian teachers and other religious teachers. They will learn from different religious speakers. So this program, we've received a pretty good response. In the last 3 years, we've trained actually more than 10,000 teachers, but about 9,000 graduated in these 3 years from the 58 classes that we have run on the basic course. So after they graduate from the basic course, we offer them also different upgrading or more advanced courses. One of them that I'm going to talk about here is what we call the hybrid upgrading workshop. So the workshop includes also an on-site meeting for 3 days where we train the teachers on how to develop lesson plans according to their subjects. But how they can integrate the principles from the cross-cultural religious literacy to teach the students. So for example, a teacher from madrasa on Quran and Hadith, for example, they will learn on how to integrate the principles of the cross-cultural religious literacy into the subject of Quran and Hadith that they are teaching. In fact, right now, we also have a teacher on mathematics that he is able to integrate the principle of the CCRL to talk about interfaith relations, religious tolerance in the math class. So in that workshop, we bring them also not only working together on developing lesson plans, but we also take them to different religious worship places so that because maybe many of the Christian teachers have never been to a mosque, or maybe many of the Muslim teachers have never been to a church. And it turns out that this experience is very meaningful for them because they feel welcome, and that really helps them to cross the barrier of the prejudice and stereotypes that they have. So after the workshop, we encourage the teachers to actually send us video on how they teach in the classroom. When we began this, we didn't know what to expect, because all of this is based on the voluntary response from the teachers. But so far, from all the workshops, we've trained hundreds of teachers in our workshops. In average, about 70% of the teachers actually send us video on how they teach in the classroom using the lesson plans that they develop to integrate the cross-cultural religious literacy principles in their subjects. So right now, we are actually including those videos in our digital library so that the teachers can also share on how they try to learn to implement the principles in the classroom. So just want to talk about one example on how apparently this program has inspired the teachers on how to implement this. So there's a teacher, Christian teachers graduates from our program, talked to a madrasa teachers who also graduated from our program, and they work together so that the Christian schools actually, earlier this year, they arranged a program where they brought the student leaders from the Christian schools to visit the madrasa. And this is the first time for both the madrasa and the schools, because this has never happened before. And it's actually pretty sensitive, but they actually like it. And the teachers support it from both schools and the madrasa, and the students also like it very much. So right now they're actually working on more activities on how they can develop more program between the two schools. So this is just one example of how they implement this. So let me just close by talking about, because Catherine also asked me to talk about how this is being tried to be implemented in other countries in the ASEAN region. So right now, actually, we are in discussion with the people in Vietnam, who is also interested in trying to see how they can implement this in Vietnam. So this actually appeared in the journal in Vietnam, written by a professor in Vietnam. So we are in discussion on how we can try to implement the CCRL approach in Vietnam. So I think let me just stop there, and then maybe we can have a discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you again, Matthias. I've been deeply impressed by the energy of Matthias himself and his program. I have to tell you that the statistics on his chart of the number of teachers go up several hundred every time I talk to him, because this is an ongoing program. But it's impressive to see efforts to spread this more widely in ASEAN, and also to think about ways that this kind of cross-cultural approach can have successful implementations in other kinds of settings. Could be used in university settings. It could be used with training of government officials. So this has great promise. So next, let me turn to Maria Lucia Uribe now from Switzerland. And she's really one of the pioneers in educational theory on these programs. So over to you, Maria Lucia.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you to the Berkley Center and IF20 for this invitation and for convening us in gathering and I think thinking together on how we advance this topic and the importance of having an education that promotes interreligious literacy, but also learning to live together. So I'm going to speak from the experience of Arigato International and the model for learning to live together that is based on an ethics education framework and approach that we developed 20 years ago. And this approach was developed through a 4-year process of dialogue between people of different faiths and secular backgrounds, experts in education, children's rights, ethics, interfaith dialogue, and peace building. Arigato also convened an interfaith council of ethics education for children with high-level people that serve as advisors, and also a working committee that held during 4 years to develop the basis of the program. And we also conducted a series of pilot workshops in 12 countries when we developed the program. And the questions that this group asked 20 years ago were, are there ethical principles that are common to all peoples, and can those shared set values and principles guide individuals, communities, and nations towards coexistence, cooperation, and respect across diverse cultures and belief systems, particularly to respond to common challenges facing the world? And if so, how can education contribute to nurturing children those ethical principles for them to learn to live together and to contribute to make their communities better? So this was a noble cause at that time, and also a unique and groundbreaking material was launched in 2008, and that is now being translated into 13 languages and is used in more than 40 countries around the world. Informal and non-formal education. This is called Learning to Live Together, an intercultural and interfaith program for ethics education. And this approach of coming together to develop a model that can foster learning to live together in a world ever more divided and polarized, as Tom was mentioning, was built on the premise that no religion is an island and no man or woman can live alone. The premise of Ubuntu, from the Zulu language, that I am because you are, we are shaped by our relationship with others. And it was developed with a focus on ethics as an approach on building relationship with others, and ethics of care that is central to all religions and is found in the principles of human rights. And it was built around four main principles. The first, the affirmation of the human dignity of each and every one. Second, the respect for the other, independently who the other is, and the search for a common ground. Third, empathizing with the other who suffers, who is different beyond religious or ethnic boundaries. For developing our ability to respond to the needs of societies and developing these individual and collective responsibilities. And fifth, fostering an attitude of reconciliation when conflicts arise. And ultimately equipping children to make ethical decisions that benefit communities and foster learning to live together. The affirmation of human dignity as central to ethics education in our approach is important in the context of persistent plurality, because historically we know that some religious traditions have taken the either or attitude in relation to others. Reflecting such attitudes is we are right, the other is wrong. If we have the truth, others do not have it. So human dignity reminds us of our shared humanity and our imperfect truths. The ethics of this framework that we have developed has an interfaith context and is primarily concerned with relationship with others. So ethics is conceived as a matter of attitude rather than a set of dogmas or teachings that we impose to children or which we wish children to learn. It's an approach to seeing the other, connecting with the other, an approach to relating to one's neighbor, to nature, to life in itself. And it is through such an attitude where the children can see the other as friends and the practice that flows from it, and not through the theory, that we understand our own traditions and that of our neighbors. So that is the premise, that we can learn about ourselves and our own religions through relating and understanding the other. So the approach is intercultural and interreligious, is grounded on the encounter with the other beyond the multi-religious aspect. So it's not just a comparative aspect, it's coming together. It affirms diversity and affirms dialogue and relation with oneself and with others in an ongoing process of individual and collective learning. So we learn together. It's not just something that is imposed, it's the building of the learning together. The model is also anchored on ethical principles upheld by all major religions and human rights declarations, making it a very easy approach to be introduced in citizenship or ethics or moral subjects, in formal education to promote solidarity, but also in religious education as a complement to religious teachings. The approach transcends religious boundaries and religious and secular settings. And we know that through the centuries, religious traditions have taught and instilled ethical values in their followers. So when we talk about ethics, we know that religious traditions feel that they own and they have the expertise on ethics and values. And some hold that it is in the religious life that children learn the values needed for a fulfilling life. So this understanding implies that religions, both by themselves and as cultural expressions, are the carriers of moral and ethical values that are taught through texts, scriptures, proverbs, examples, and practices. And it is through communities that those values are passed. And this makes ethics education programs that support learning to live together a critical aspect of education provided by religious communities, as well as an important contribution to ensure that those values that are taught through formal education foster respect for diversity and living together. So what is taught to children in schools matters. And if those values are not inclusive, we create more divisions in our societies. So the approach is also built on the premise that learning to live together goes beyond coming together to learn about differences and similarities, but it's about the need to build relationship with others and engage with one another to shape who we are in the relationship with the other. And this is particularly important as we live in a time not only of an increased awareness of religious plurality, we're also witnessing the role of religion in conflict, the growing place of religion in public life and politics, all presenting us with challenges that require greater understanding and cooperation among peoples of different faiths. So this ethics education framework has 4 pillars. It's a child rights center. Second is built on ethics and values as paramount to building relationships. Third is founded in the need to live in plural societies where interreligious learning is not only a sine qua non, but it also connects with something else, which is fostering the spirituality in each child, a spirituality that strengthens our interconnectedness, the notion of our interdependence with one another, the sense that we hold the lives of each other in our lives, and that we do and do not do have an impact on ourselves and others. And also it has a strong pedagogical approach. So it is not enough to talk about the other, to come to the encounter. The approach needs to be pedagogically sound, and it has to be transformative. So it's dialogical approach, breaking the vertical approach where the adults kind of teach the child, through a horizontal approach whereby knowledge is constructed, is through collaborative and cooperative learning, case studies, games, dilemmas, field visits, and developing collective action. So ultimately, we want the children to come together across these boundaries and develop projects in their communities, in their schools, inviting others in the community. The program has been integrated in non-formal educational settings through our global network, Religions for Children, and informal education through networks of schools, as well as in religious communities. We are now working with ministries of education in 6 countries, Kenya, Seychelles, Mauritius, Indonesia, Nepal, and Bangladesh, to influence education systems. And we have programs with these ministries of education to develop national in-service and pre-service training programs, reviewing the curricula, and developing materials for teachers and children. The program is available for children 6 to 11 and for 12 to 18 years old, and we work with facilitators in formal and non-formal settings. We have specialized training programs for facilitators and trainers, as we believe that the training of the facilitators is very critical, as they are the ones that can create a safe learning environment, promote dialogue, and construct classrooms that can serve as social equalizers. I'm going to leave it here, but I want to leave with these 3 challenges that we have faced in our work. One is that in religious majority contexts, we have faced opposition from religious communities when we try to integrate this program, because they think that this is trying to bring understanding about other faiths that can impact the understanding and the faith of their own followers. The second is the danger of reducing learning to live together to the minimum common denominator, so tolerance, or just learning the basic tenets of each religion. So similar to what Matthews was saying, it's moving beyond that, but we always risk that when we bring the program, when we work with governments, that they don't want to do what is required, that they want to go through the minimum. And the third is the instrumentalization of programs to achieve a goal when it is actually in the process that learning takes place. And I'm saying this because very often when we work with governments, they want to use the program on ethics because they want children to be good citizens. And that's it. And then it's in the process of learning with the other who is different, where you learn to be a good citizen. So it's not that goal, it is in the learning and how we include the other. I will leave it there, Cole and colleagues.
Well, thank you, Maria Lucia. I think everyone listening has some sense of the growing sense of the array of educational tools that are around, and the challenges that we face. Let me just say, we've learned from sad experience with the richness of these seminars that it's hard to do a Q&A session at the end, but we do encourage people to send in questions to the Q&A, and we're doing our best to respond to those offline. But let me turn now to Rodrigo, who, as I said, has just come through the well, to use a religious image, the baptism of fire of being the local chair of the G20 interfaith in Brazil. But he was remarkably successful, and he's also a very thoughtful educator on these issues. So, Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cole, for the introduction, and I am also grateful for this invitation to join this webinar series. So thank you very much, not only to the IF20, but also to the Berkley Center at the University of Georgetown. Indeed, it was a very intense year, but a very good one. So it was amazing to be a part of this process that connected people from all parts of the world and from different sectors and different religious and academic backgrounds, right? And so it was indeed, as Tom mentioned in the beginning, it was a great gathering of more than 400 people, and education was the event itself was an educational experience, since we learned from each other, and the results, the recommendations, the papers and the briefs and everything that was or that is a result of this process will certainly be helpful for educators from different parts of the world. So the G20 interfaith was a part of this process that Brazil called the G20 Social. So the summit of the G20 Social will take place very soon, in about 15 days. And as IF20, we are getting ready for that event. And the G20 Social was or is a key feature of the Brazilian G20 presidency. The G20 had the commitment to include civil society in the development of the policies, and as a part of this dialogical process. And the idea or the purpose of the G20 Social is to enhance the involvement of non-governmental sectors or actors in the G20 activities and decision-making. The general theme for the G20 and for the G20 process was building a just world and a sustainable planet. So during this almost 1 year now, the process of almost 1 year, the G20 Social included different voices and established as one of its working groups, a working group on education. So here we have, in this working group on education, there were 3 main priorities that was elected by their members. That was to enhance the status of education professionals through international training programs, sharing resources related to education for sustainable development, the EDS, especially on digital platforms, and 3, to organize a kind of virtual exhibition of best practices on school community engagement. The 2 first priorities on education of the G20 Social then was more developed during this process, which is to value the status of education professionals and to share resources on education for sustainable development. So these three priority areas for the education within the G20 was inspired by the fact that the education sector is currently facing a critical shortage of teachers. So data gathered by the working group stressed that by 2029, the world will have the largest as its largest demographic group, people aged between 12 and 16. So the problem is that you have less teachers and more children, and that's a problem. So there's a gap that has to be bridged. And the second main priority was to connect managers of digital resource platforms. So the idea is that there are very good digital resources in the world today for teachers. However, the platforms that offer this kind of digital resources are disconnected, and many teachers do not have access to those very good resource materials, especially in the digital platforms. So the purpose is to somehow contribute to increase access to these platforms and to connect managers of national platforms, creating this kind of a network of best practices, which also includes the third priority, that is to enhance the school community engagement. And right now, today is October 29, and today and tomorrow, Brazil is hosting the Education Ministerial, and in the state of Ceará, in the northeast of Brazil. And so that in that meeting, ministers of education and international organizations will discuss some of the developments that were achieved during this year and also plan for the future. And in all those areas, religion is not a big issue from the perspective of the G20. So from my perspective, what Maria Lucia Uribe and Matias Ho are doing in their own areas of activity and their own institutions is or are excellent best practices from the interfaith sector that could contribute to this kind of discussions also in the future in South Africa and other the other G20 countries. That's I'm well, we heard here from them how those methodologies and strategies are helpful and the impact that they can bring to community in general. So adding an interfaith perspective, training teachers, equipping schools on interfaith dialogue, and also including interfaith perspectives in other areas of education is certainly something very positive for social cohesion in the most diverse countries, especially because, as Tom mentioned in the beginning, more than 80% of the world population is religious. So religious is a key characteristic in most of our societies. Latin America, where I come from, is has been a very strong religious part of the world, and it's in religious engagement is increasing in spite of the secularization processes. So in the region, for example, there are two groups that are growing very fast. That is the more religious groups and the nuns, those that are not affiliated, and a small group of atheists and agnostics. So religion is very important in the world, and the idea from the 60s that while the world will become a more modern and rationalized and secularized, religious engagement would reduce actually what's happening. And the sociologists of religion themselves are not only recognizing, but are studying this as a very important fact, is that religion is here. Religion is present in the world, and education cannot close its eyes for this fact, and should include somehow the perspectives from religious communities and from the interfaith sector. As Cole mentioned in the beginning, that I lead a center in Brazil. It's a center on law and religion. So we explore different kinds of interactions between religions and state, and education is one of the aspects that we explore. So we established a collaboration with the Brazilian Ministry of Education last year in order to develop content and educational materials for the public servants, the civil servants from all over Brazil. And one of our main target groups is the education, the people that work at educational departments, secretaries from states and from municipalities. We are more than 5,000 municipalities in Brazil and 27 states. So we've developed this material. Now they are being published, which will be accessible for those people, including teachers, on how to promote freedom, equality, non-discrimination, mutual respect, how to deal healthily with religion-state relations, because many of those schools are state schools or state-sponsored schools, what we call public schools, and how to address problems like hate and hate speech and hate crimes and this kind of things in the country. So I'm sure that the religious component will certainly be helpful for teachers, and the experience that we have also in Brazil with, for example, as we are in a webinar sponsored by Berkeley, the Catholic universities, the Catholic schools in Brazil are among the best of the education institutions in Brazil, are very traditional schools, and promotes high quality education without avoiding to include its own religious perspectives, and also interfaith perspectives in their curriculum and in their daily practice. So I would like to thank you, Cole, for the invitation, and I'm here for the Q&A. Thank you.
So I thanks again to Rodrigo and to the others. I'm going to focus on the Q&A on a question from myself. I apologize to our audience members, but let me just say, I think what you have just heard is a very contemporary, nuanced, and sophisticated set of approaches to facilitating engagement of religion in the modern world, and in a way that can counter some of the polarization that we're all conscious of and that has been highlighted to some extent here. I remember about 15 years ago being in charge of a program with another co-chair for the OSCE on teaching about religion, which was, of course, at the time was something that was thought of as a creative way to help facilitate more understanding and cross-cultural kind of understanding. There are a number of things I learned from that experience, but I would say one of the fundamental things is the shortage of trained teachers, particularly since you know, if you want to be a math teacher, you can study math at the university, and maybe you have a few pedagogical courses, but then you teach math. If you The same with history, although there you may need to have more cross-cultural sensitivity. But if you're teaching about religion, you have to not only know something about your own religion, you have to know about other religions. And you can sense, just thinking about that, how anyone charged with this is underqualified and usually undertaught. And so this highlighted for me the perspective on that. Now, the other thing in my position as president of the G20 Interfaith, we think about these issues, but we think about impact. People think about the G20, and your first assumption is that it's about 20 very powerful economic countries, and that's true. But it's been the 19 plus the EU, which ups the numbers into the 40s. And then a couple of years ago, we added membership of the African Union, which brings the coverage up to closer to 100 countries. So this is genuinely global in many respects. And the question I have, and maybe I can think, can refer this to the panelists for very short comments, really a minute or so. But are there ways that you see that we can work to have more impact? One of the things I've realized is that even if we succeed on getting some kind of statement into the formal communique of the G20 leaders, that's not where the real impact happens. It's things like what's going on today in Brazil with the educational ministries meeting. There are questions about how you work with ministries. Maria Lucia has talked some about that. There are questions about how you've spread across national boundaries that Matthias has talked about. There are questions about how one mobilizes universities in general and in specific training programs. I'm just interested in any comments or insights you have about ways that we as a G20 organization can have particular emphasis or impact. Are there things we should be highlighting more? Are there things that we can do more? I think part of what you're seeing is crystallization of ways of doing things and best practices. But are there any other questions? Let me just go quickly through the groups, maybe starting with Tom, and see if you have anything that you could add or suggest to us.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, great to hear colleagues from more detail of your incredible work, and great to be part of this network. The issue is always impact, and the issue is how do we accompany the G20, or for that matter, the G7 or the UN system, where we have political and policy elites that in many cases are accustomed precisely not to bring in religion for any number of reasons. And I think it's going to be a continued long-term effort on our part. And the Interfaith Forum has done an amazing job these last several years of really working, listening to and working with the host governments of the G20 meetings. And Rodrigo, your work there has been incredible. So I see progress over time. The one thing I would add, and I hinted at this in my remarks, why does religion matter? Well, your citizens are religious. Their faith commitments relate to our commitments around critical social and policy issues such as climate change. But at a time when democracy is under threat around the world, I think the importance of dialogue across divides within and across our societies is something political elites in democracies have woken up to. And there we really do have a long history now of interfaith engagement across what historically have been the most severe divides across our religious traditions. And yet there we've managed to model new ways of dialogue, again, what Pope Francis calls the creation of a culture of encounter, which is something our democratic societies need. So we should keep in mind democracy and as well as the various policy priorities as we push forward with this important work.
Thank you very much. Matthias.
Thanks, Scott. I think in terms, in the context of the G20, one of the important things is that I think the government actually needs to voice out, I mean, what we want them, the importance, the priority, because it is the government, it is the states that can really have an impact, I think, in the voice of the G20. Of course, the civil society is very important, and we need to recognize that a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation can be done in the civil society because we have more flexibility. But I think what we are learning from our program here in Indonesia is that the question is that how we as a civil society, for example, can build a partnership, a constructive partnership with the government. And in doing so, actually, we need to have the flexibility and the capability to actually understand where the priorities of the government and in what ways what we are doing, our innovation can support as well the interests of the country. And then from there, if they believe that this is an important thing, then we can work with them to bring this up in a meeting in the G20 context. Just to give you an example, that's why we are working very closely, for example, with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, for example, and in our CCRL, Cross-Cultural Religious Literacy Program, we actually have a workshop for the teachers as one of the advanced courses on strengthening religious freedom and rule of law, actually for the teachers. And that workshop actually in partnership with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, we try to train the teachers on how to train simple principles of religious freedom and rule of law so that the teachers can also learn how to teach that principles to the students. So just today, actually, I have another meeting with the ministry, and they actually want to involve us in the discussion for the what they call the Human Rights Action Plan for the next 20 years in Indonesia. And they also want to see on how the cross-cultural religious literacy can also be part of that. And that's also another reason why we are also working very closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because interfaith dialogue is actually part of their public diplomacy as well. So I think it's very important for us, in the civil society to see how we can work together and in a way to be flexible as well in terms of what we do. So because then we need to help the government to see the importance on what we do, but at the same time to fit as well in the policy that they have. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria Lucia. We're running low on time, but you've had a lot of practical experience working with governments and others.
Yes, and I'm thinking, Cole, two-way. I think we need to bring more dialogue with different governments. And maybe one thing that we can do as a very concrete is to engage with the governments that we are working with, Brazil, Indonesia, and working with 6 governments more actively at the moment. Maybe have a round table, a discussion where we put these issues on the table and see how else it can be taken, through different systems at the country level. That's one thing. But I'm also thinking, Cole, that we should work more closely with the Interparliamentarian Union, because I think they have prioritized in the past interfaith dialogue, not so much interfaith education, but there is an openness and already a priority on how interfaith dialogue can support social cohesion. And I think that's a good entry point as, pushing in a way governments to think about the importance of interfaith learning and education. So that for me will be very important, that maybe as IF20 we can engage more in those dialogues and not just talking among us, but actually bringing them to the table.
So, Rodrigo, final word.
Thank you. Well, I thought of 2 initiatives that could be stressed. The first one is to include religious literacy for social cohesion, human rights, sustainable development, democracy, and in the national education plans. I don't know exactly, probably Maria Lucia, who is everywhere, knows more about this than any of us here. But from our experience in Brazil, we do have a national plan for education that has the general guidance and instructions, not specific, but like general contents that should be included in each individual school. So I think advocacy work or sharing knowledge with officers that work at Ministry of Education, for example, is one important strategy to reach and to impact the entire country. And secondly, I am from a university, and in my university, we train the educators. We are the ones that provide the professional training for the school teachers in our region, for example, but universities in general are responsible for equipping teachers. So trying to bridge the gap between the religious studies or the sociology of religion area and the pedagogical studies, I think would be important to include in the curriculum of the universities. Of course, universities usually have autonomy to establish their own training curriculum, but encouraging those academic institutions to include religious literacy, I think would somehow deal with the problem of having teachers that are properly equipped to deal with religious issues inside of their classes. So universities are very strategic places for that.
Well, thank you to our distinguished panel for their insights, for their practical insights into different programs that are actually working, carrying this work to a new level. We're thankful for their engagement with the G20 process, and I think the last few comments have underscored the fact that some of the real impact happens not so much in something like the final communique or something like that, but communicating with the people who are really running policy and administration, the next level down, but who listen and hear some of the voices at the G20 level. I think this underscores the importance of what can be done, how much lies ahead, and thanks to these four representative leaders and thinkers on these issues. Thank you so much. Be sure and send questions you have in. This event should be fully recorded and up on the Berkley website and the G20 Interfaith website within a week. So spread this to others. We know that often we have twice as many people listening after the fact as during. So share this quality event with your friends. Thank you so much.